The knock at dawn, the air was quiet that morning, heavy with the weight of early fog. Sundar Pichai was awake before the sun, as he often was. He liked those hours before the world demanded anything from him, before the emails, the meetings, the endless choices. He would sit in his modest kitchen with a small cup of chai, looking out at the garden he had planted himself years ago. He was stirring the tea when he heard it. A knock at the door. Sharp, hurried dot was unusual. Not many people came to his home, especially not at 5 in the morning. He stood still for a second, unsure if he had imagined it. Then it came again. 3 knocks this time. He opened the door. At first, he didn't see anything. Only the fog curling around the empty steps. Then he looked down. There, wrapped in a thin blue blanket, was a baby. His breath caught. He crouched down instinctively. The baby was asleep, cheeks flushed, fingers curled into tiny fists. Next to the baby was a folded note, held in place by a small rock. He picked up the note with trembling hands. The handwriting was shaky, but careful. It said, "You will know what to do. Please take care of him. His name is Arav. He belongs to you more than to me." There was no name, no explanation, no phone number. Nothing but the sleeping baby in those haunting words. Sundar stood there for what felt like an eternity. The world outside was silent, almost respectful in a moment. Then Arav stirred in the blanket and let out a soft cry. Sundar bent down and gently picked him up. The boy was light but warm, his small eyes fluttering open. In that instant, Sundar felt something unfamiliar and powerful move through him. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. But his mind was already racing. Who had left this child? What did the note mean? Why him? And what would he tell his family, his colleagues? He set Arav down on the couch and reached for his phone. But as his fingers hovered over the numbers, he stopped. Something about the note, about that last line, made him pause. "He belongs to you more than to me." That sentence felt like a lock in his chest turning, revealing a door he hadn't even known was there. He didn't call anyone. Not yet. Instead, he sat on the couch, the baby in his arms, and stared at the note again. It was then that he noticed something else. Written in faint pencil marks on the back of the paper was a number. Very faint, almost erased. He quickly wrote it down on another piece of paper before it disappeared completely. His hands were shaking as he dialed. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice, low and tired, answered. "You got him?" The voice said. Sundar froze. "Who are you?" Sundar asked. "That doesn't matter," the voice said. "What matters is what you choose to do next." Before Sundar could say anything else, the line went dead. He stared at the phone. Stunned. Arav made a small sound, like a sigh, and nestled closer to him. By the time the sun rose, Sundar had changed Arav into a fresh onesie he found in the small bag left beside the blanket. He didn't even know if he was doing it right. He'd never dressed a baby before. But somehow it felt natural. He called his assistant to say he wouldn't be coming in that day. He didn't offer an explanation, and she didn't ask. Hours passed in a blur of feeding, changing, rocking. At one point, as he held Arav against his chest, he realized he hadn't thought about work even once all morning. But just as he was beginning to settle into the strange rhythm of this new reality, the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find a woman standing there. She was young, with dark hair tied back, and her eyes were red from crying. "You have my baby," she whispered. Sundar's stomach dropped. You left him here?" "Yes." She shook her head violently. "No, I didn't. Someone took him from me, but I think they wanted you to find him." She was trembling. He stepped aside and let her in. The woman sat on the edge of his couch, staring at Arav, who was sleeping peacefully in a soft nest of blankets. "What do you mean?" Sundar asked gently. She looked up at him then, her eyes full of something he couldn't quite name. Fear, sadness, but also determination. "There are things you don't know," she said, "about yourself, about him, but you will, soon." Then she stood up abruptly. "I have to go," she said. "Wait." Sundar called after her. You can't just... But she was already gone, leaving the faint scent of jasmine behind her. That night, Sundar sat at the kitchen table, the baby monitor. Beside him, he couldn't sleep. Couldn't stop thinking about her words. There are things you don't know. About yourself. About him. He thought of his own childhood. How he'd grown up in a small home in Chennai. His parents doing everything they could to give him a better life. He thought of the choices he had made, the path he had taken to get here. But this felt like something entirely outside of that at around midnight, as he was finally starting to drift off. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. The message said, "He's not safe." They know you have him. Don't trust anyone. His blood ran cold. He rushed to the baby's room. Arrow was still there, sleeping soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling. But as Sundar stood there, he thought he heard something outside, footsteps. On the gravel path, he held his breath, and then there was another knock at the door. Slow, deliberate. Asterisk, the visitor in the fog knock. Came again. Slow, deliberate. Each strike of knuckle on wood seemed to echo in the quiet house, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Sundar stood in the hallway, his hand still on the frame of Arav's bedroom door. For a moment, he wondered if he had imagined it. Maybe the fog outside was playing tricks on his mind. But then came a third knock, firmer this time, with a faint scrape at the end, as though whoever stood there was losing patience. He glanced at the baby monitor sitting on the dresser. The faint green light blinked steadily, and through it he could hear Arav's soft breathing from the crib. Sundar's own breath was shallow now, and his fingers tightened into fists at his sides. His home had always been a sanctuary, quiet, simple, a place where he could retreat from the world. But now, with a stranger's baby asleep in the next room and that ominous message still glowing on his phone screen, it no longer felt like his own. He walked slowly toward the front door, his bare feet soundless on the cool wooden floor. Outside, the fog pressed thick against the windows, making the street lamps glow like distant moons. When he reached the door, he stood for several seconds without touching it, his ear close to the wood. He thought he could hear the faint rustle of clothing, a faint breath. Someone was definitely out there, waiting. Taking a deep breath. Sundar unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough to see the figure on the porch was tall, wrapped in a long gray coat that hung heavy with dew. The fog curled around their feet like a living thing, and their face was hidden beneath the shadow of a wide hood. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sundar's hand tightened on the edge of the door. He could feel the faint warmth of the baby. Monitor still clutched in his other hand, as if it were his only anchor. Finally, the figure spoke, their voice low but strangely calm. "You're holding something that belongs to more people than you know," the stranger said. Sundar blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Who are you?" he asked, his own voice hoarse with fatigue and tension. The figure didn't answer the question. Instead, they tilted their head slightly, as though weighing whether to say more. Then they extended a hand from within the folds of their coat. In their palm lay a small square photograph. Hesitantly, Sundar reached out and took it. It was a picture of a man and woman standing in front of a crumbling building. The woman was holding a baby, Arav, and both she and the man were smiling, faintly, though their eyes looked tired. Written on the back of the photograph in the same shaky handwriting, as the note was a single line: "If you care about him, come to the place where it began." Before Sundar could ask what it meant, the stranger took a step back, fading into the fog. He tried to follow, stepping barefoot onto the cold porch, but by the time he reached the bottom step, the figure had vanished, leaving only the faint smell of earth and smoke behind. The rest of the night passed in a haze of confusion and unease. Sundar sat at the kitchen table with the photograph laid out in front of him, studying every detail. He felt a strange weight in his chest, a mixture of fear and a growing sense of responsibility. He didn't know these people. He didn't know why Arav had been left with him. Yet somehow he couldn't shake the feeling that he was already Part of whatever story had begun here. He thought of calling the police again, but the memory of the text message, "Don't trust anyone," stopped him. Who would he even explain it to? A baby appeared on my doorstep. A stranger called. A woman cried in my living room. Then someone in the fog gave me a photo. It sounded ridiculous, even to himself. In the crib. Arav shifted and let out a tiny cry. Sundar rose instinctively, his exhaustion forgotten, and picked him up. The baby's face was flushed from sleep, his tiny fist gripping Sundar's shirt. As he cradled the child in his arms. Sundar felt something unfamiliar grow inside him, a quiet resolve. Whatever. He couldn't just turn his back now. In the morning, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing a cold, pale sky. Sundar dressed quickly and packed a small bag of essentials, diapers, formula, a few changes of clothes for both himself and Arav. He placed the photograph carefully in his jacket pocket and slipped the note in his wallet. He didn't know where he was going yet, but he couldn't stay here, not when someone out there clearly knew where to find them. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway and looked back. At his home, everything was just as it had always been. The neat bookshelves, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint scent of cardamom and tea still clinging to the kitchen. But it no longer felt safe. He strapped Arav into the car seat, awkwardly, still fumbling with the straps, and drove without a clear destination. He avoided the main highways, choosing instead a winding road that snaked through the outskirts of the city. As he drove, Arav fell asleep again, his head tilted to one side. Sundar kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another car following them, but the road behind remained empty. Then, about an hour outside the city, he spotted something that made his breath catch. On the side of the road stood a building that looked eerily similar to the one in the photograph, its walls cracked and worn, ivy crawling up the stones. It was smaller than he expected, almost forgotten among the surrounding trees. He pulled over and sat for a long time, staring at it. Finally, he got out of the car, holding Arav close to his chest. The building loomed quietly before him, its windows dark. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled faintly of damp earth. The interior was empty except for a few broken chairs and a scattering of old papers on the floor. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, casting thin beams of light across the dusty room. In the center of the room was a single table, and on it lay another photograph, waiting, as though someone had known he would come. His stomach tightened as he picked it up. This one showed the same woman from before. But now she was alone, holding Arav even closer, her face wet with tears. Behind her, scrawled on the wall in faint chalk, were the words, "Trust is a choice." Below the photograph was a folded piece of paper. With shaking hands, he unfolded it and read, "You are closer than you think, but so are they. Leave before it's too late." At that moment, he heard the creak of a floorboard behind him. He spun around, clutching Arav tightly. A man stood there in the shadows. He was tall, dressed in black, his eyes sharp and unblinking. Sundar's breath caught in his throat as the man stepped closer. "You shouldn't have come here," the man said softly. Sundar backed away, bumping into the table. His fingers tightened on Arav, who began to whimper, sensing the tension. The man stopped just a few feet away, his gaze fixed on Sundar. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into," he said. "You think this is about kindness? About doing the right thing, but it's bigger than that, bigger than you." Sundar swallowed hard, his heart hammering. "Who are you?" He managed to whisper. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "Someone who knows," he replied. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table between them, his movements deliberate and calm. "Read this," he said. "But if you do, there's no going back." He turned and walked out before Sundar could say another word. The door creaking shut behind him. Sundar stood frozen in the empty room, staring at the folded paper on the table. His hands trembled as he reached for it. Just as he began to unfold the paper, the sound of a car engine roared to life outside. Sundar rushed to the window and saw a black car speeding away down the road. dust rising behind it. He felt a sudden chill, realizing that he was alone again, but not really alone. He could feel it now, eyes watching him from somewhere unseen, waiting for him to make his next move. He looked down at the paper in his hands. The first line read, "The truth about Arav is the truth about you. But you only have until tomorrow to decide your own. Asterisk." The choice in the shadow sundar stood there for what felt like hours, though only minutes passed. The thin paper in his hand trembled as he read and reread the opening line. The truth about Arav is the truth about you. But you only have until tomorrow to decide which side you're on. The words seemed alive somehow, carrying more weight than their size allowed. His eyes lingered on that phrase, which side you're on, and he felt his chest tighten. He sat down heavily on the cold wooden floor, holding Arav close, his back pressed against the cracked wall of the abandoned building. The baby stirred, slightly, his small face brushing against Sundar's neck. As though sensing his unease, the air inside the building had grown colder now, and the silence was so deep it hurt his ears. Sundar leaned his head back and closed his eyes, trying to remember how all of this had even begun. This yesterday morning, he'd been an ordinary man, or so he thought, waking early for tea, preparing for meetings, planning another predictable day. Now he was here, in a forgotten ruin at the edge of nowhere, with a baby who wasn't his yet somehow felt like he was. And a note that hinted at a truth Sundar wasn't sure he was ready to learn. He looked again at the rest of the paper, forcing himself to focus despite the weight of exhaustion pressing on him. Below the opening line, written in the same faint, careful handwriting, was an address. No name, no explanation. Just a string of numbers in a street he didn't recognize. Next to the address were 2 more sentences. You have to see it for yourself. Don't let them follow you. Then, at the very bottom, a final warning scrawled more hastily, as though the writer had run out of time. He's more than just a child. You're more than just a man. Sundar folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his fingers lingering there for a moment. The words echoed inside him, sharp and insistent. He stood, cradling Arav more securely in his arms, and stepped outside. The air outside felt thicker now, as though the fog had never really left. It only crouched in the trees and fields, waiting to creep back in when he wasn't looking. The drive toward the address took longer than it should have. Sundar found himself glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds, convinced he would see a black car or shadowy figure following them. But the road behind remained empty, a ribbon of cracked asphalt stretching endlessly into gray. Arav slept for most of the journey, his soft breathing a quiet reassurance in the otherwise tense silence of the car. When he finally turned onto the street from the note, he was surprised to find himself in an old neighborhood where every house seemed to lean a little too far, where fences sagged and paint peeled, and yet there was something quiet and dignified about it all. He parked in front of a small, plain house near the end of the street. The curtains were drawn, the windows dusty, but a thin line of smoke curled from the chimney. Sundar sat there for a while, staring at the house, gathering the courage to get out. Finally, he unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped. Into the chill air. He carried Arav up the walkway and knocked gently, unsure what to expect. There was no answer at first. Then, faintly, the sound of slow footsteps approached from the other side of the door. It creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with deep-set eyes and hair like silver threads pulled into a bun. She looked at Sundar for a long time, her gaze moving briefly to Arav, then back to him. "You're late," she said simply, her voice calm but firm. Sundar blinked, taken aback. You were expecting me?" Yes. She didn't answer, only stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. The interior of the house was dimly lit, but warm, filled with the smell of herbs and something faintly sweet, like honey. Old photographs lined the walls, black and white images of people standing in front of unfamiliar places, always looking slightly away from the camera. As though watching something just out of sight, she led him to a small table in the kitchen, and gestured for him to sit. You don't know yet, do you? She said softly. More statement than question. Sundar shook his head slowly. Who are you? Yes. She sat across from him, her hands resting on the table. Someone who owes you answers. She replied. For a long moment. The only sound was the quiet ticking of an old clock on the wall. Then she leaned forward, her expression growing. Serious. What you're holding, she said, her eyes flicking briefly to Arav, is not just a baby. And you are not just a man. Sundar felt his throat go dry. What does that mean? He managed to say. She exhaled slowly, as though the words she was about to speak carried more weight than she could bear. It means, she said, that everything you've believed about yourself, about your past, is only half the truth. You've lived your life thinking you were one kind of man, but you were chosen long before you ever stepped into the life you thought you wanted. And now, she reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a small, weathered box. She placed it gently on the table between them. Now it's time for you to see. She opened the box, revealing a collection of folded papers, faded photographs, and a small pendant shaped like a star. She picked up the pendant and held it toward. This belonged to your father, she said quietly. Sundar's stomach dropped. My father? No, my father. The man who raised you was not the man who gave you life, she interrupted gently. He was kind, yes, and he did his best. But there was another man before him, and he left you with a burden and a gift you were never meant to ignore. Forever. Sundar sat in stunned silence, the words swirling in his mind, colliding with memories of his childhood. His father's quiet strength, his mother's gentle voice, the small house in Chennai. The woman placed the pendant in his hand, curling his fingers around it. That child, she continued, nodding toward Arav, carries the same burden, the same gift. They brought him to you because you are the only one left who can protect him, who can teach him what you were never taught. Sundar stared down at the pendant in his palm. It was heavier than it looked, cool against his skin, and when he tilted, he thought he saw faint markings etched into its surface. Who are they? Sundar asked finally. His voice low. The woman's expression darkened. They are the ones who have been watching you since the day you were born, she said, and they are not kind. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You can stay here tonight, she said, her voice softer now. But in the morning, you must go. There is another place you must reach before they find you. Everything depends on it. Before Sundar could ask more, she quietly left the room, leaving him alone with Arav and the box of secrets. That night, Sundar sat awake long after the house fell silent. Arav slept curled against him, his tiny hand resting on Sundar's chest. Outside, the fog had returned, thick and unyielding. Pressing against the windows like a living thing, he opened the box again, pulling out one of the photographs. It was a picture of the woman who had appeared at his door the night before, holding a much younger Sundar in her arms. Behind her stood the same building he had visited earlier. Written on the back in faint ink were the words, "You are the key." Set the photo down, his hands trembling. But then he noticed something strange at the bottom of the box. Half buried beneath the papers was a small envelope sealed with red wax. He picked it up, studying it. It bore no name, no address, just the same star symbol from the pendant. Pressed deep into the wax. With a deep breath, he broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The words written there were brief but enough to make his blood run cold. We know where you are. Leave the child by the old bridge before dawn if you want to live. Just as he finished reading, the sound of footsteps on the porch made him freeze, and then came another knock. Slow, deliberate. The bridge at dawn knock came again, louder this time, reverberating through the quiet house. Sundar froze where he sat, the sealed envelope still clutched in his hand. The wax seal, now broken, lay like a splash of blood on the table. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows, almost as if it was alive and watching him from every angle. He stood up slowly, careful not to wake Arav, who lay in a fragile bundle in his lap. Each footstep toward the door felt heavier than the last, like walking through water. He felt a faint sweat on his forehead despite the chill in the air. When he reached the door, he didn't open it right away. He pressed his ear against the wood and listened. This time there were no footsteps, no shifting of weight, no breath, only silence. Yet he felt it, the presence of someone or something waiting on the other side. He swallowed hard, tightened his grip on the door handle, and opened it just a crack. The porch was empty. But pinned to the door outside was another note, held in place by a small silver pin. The paper was damp from the fog, but still legible. The handwriting was the same as before, sharp and deliberate. You have until sunrise. The bridge is waiting. Come alone. Or neither of you leaves alive. Sundar stood there for a long time staring at the note, his fingers trembling slightly. He felt an ache in his chest as he thought of the tiny baby asleep inside. Completely unaware of the danger swirling around them, he closed the door quietly and went back to the table, sinking into the chair. The house felt colder now, as though the very walls were holding their breath. The old woman appeared silently in the doorway, watching him. Her eyes softened slightly when she saw him sitting there with the note. They've given you the choice, she said softly, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. Sundar looked up at her, his jaw tight. Why? He asked, his voice low. Why? Me? Why this baby? What do they want from us? The woman stepped closer and placed her weathered hands on the table, leaning in slightly. Because, she said, you are the one who was meant to carry the truth forward. And they are. Afraid of the truth, afraid of what you might remember, afraid of what he might become. Her eyes flicked toward Arav, who shifted slightly in his sleep, his tiny fingers curling into a fist. But if you take him to the bridge, she continued, if you leave him there, you give up that truth forever, and you live. That's what they're counting on, that you're too afraid to see this through. Sundar looked down at the envelope still in his hand. The weight of the decision felt like a stone pressing into his chest. What happens if I don't go? He asked quietly. The woman's face darkened. Then they will come here, and they will not ask again. Just before dawn, the sky began to turn a faint, bruised purple. Sundar stood outside the house with Arav bundled against his chest, the fog curling thick around his legs. The woman handed him a small pouch before he left. Inside was the star-shaped pendant, a folded piece of paper he hadn't dared to read yet, and a vial of something dark and viscous that she told him only to use if he had no other choice. He got into the car and started the engine, the sound breaking the silence of the street like glass. His hands tightened on the wheel as he drove toward the bridge, each mile feeling longer than the one before. Arav was quiet, his small breath warm against Sundar's neck, as though trusting him completely with understanding why. The road grew narrower and darker as he neared the edge of town. Trees lined both sides, their bare branches arching over the road like skeletal fingers. At last, through the fog, he saw the faint outline of the bridge, an old stone structure that stretched over a dry river. He stopped the car a few feet away and sat for a moment, staring at it. The bridge looked ancient, almost as though it had been waiting all these years for this moment. He could see faint shadows at the far end, tall, indistinct figures just beyond the reach of the weak-gone light. He got out of the car slowly, keeping Arav pressed close to his chest. The air here was colder than before, and the fog was so thick it clung to his eyelashes, dampening his skin. As he took his first step onto the bridge, the silence deepened. The only sound was the faint crunch of gravel under his shoes and the steady rhythm of Arav's breath. Halfway across the bridge, he stopped. The figures at the end began to move toward him, slow and deliberate, their shapes still impossible to make out clearly. You've made the right choice. A voice called out from the fog, low, smooth, and strangely familiar. Sundar's pulse quickened. He felt the words in his chest rather than in his ears. Leave him here, the voice continued, and walk away. You don't have to know more. You don't have to carry what isn't yours. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening protectively around Arav. The baby stirred slightly, but did not wake. The voice came again, closer now, more insistent. You can't protect him. You can't even protect yourself. Leave him, and we let you walk away. Take him, and everything you fear will come true. Sundar closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the sound. He thought of his childhood, of his father teaching him to respect everyone, no matter how small, of his mother's quiet resilience. He thought of the woman at the house saying, "You are more than just a man." He opened his eyes and took another step forward. "I'm not leaving him," he said quietly. But firmly Dot for a moment, the fog seemed to shiver, as though the bridge itself had heard him. The figure stopped moving. The air grew colder, Dot, then the voice spoke again, colder this time. "Then you've chosen death." There was a sudden rush of wind, and the figures began moving faster now, closing the distance between them and Sundar. He backed up a step, clutching the pouch in his jacket pocket, feeling the shape of the vial inside. "Don't make me," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to them. But they kept coming. Dot at the last moment. He pulled the vial from the pouch, uncorked it with shaking fingers, and threw it hard at the ground between them. The vial shattered with a sharp crack, and a cloud of black smoke erupted from it, thick and choking, swirling around the figures like a living thing. He heard them hiss and stumble back, their outlines twisting in the fog. He didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned and ran, clutching Arav tight against his chest, his feet pounding against the stones of the bridge as the wind howled around him. He reached the car and slammed the door shut, his breath coming in harsh gasps as he started the engine and sped away. He glanced once in the rearview mirror. Through the fog, he saw the figures still standing at the bridge, watching him. And just before the road curved out of sight, he saw one of them raise a hand and point. Not at him, but at Arav, and in the faint dawn light, he finally saw their eyes. They weren't human. He drove until the sun was fully up, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his heart still hammering. He didn't know where he was going anymore, only that he couldn't stop yet. Eventually, he pulled into an empty parking lot beside a diner, the kind of place where the neon sign buzzes faintly even during the day. He sat in the car for a while, his forehead resting on the steering wheel, the weight of what had just happened. Pressing down on him, he thought of the woman's words. Again, everything you've believed about yourself is only half the truth. After a while, Arav stirred in his arms and opened his eyes. For the first time, Sundar noticed something strange about them. In the sunlight, they seemed to shimmer faintly, as though hiding something vast and ancient just beneath the surface. And then, without warning, Arav reached up with his tiny hand and touched the pendant around Sundar's neck. The star-shaped metal grew warm under his fingers, and the air in the car seemed to shift, brighter somehow. Heavier. And that was when Sundar heard another voice. But this time, it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside his own mind. "You've chosen well," the voice said, quiet but powerful, echoing in a way that felt both comforting and terrifying. "But you are not ready yet, and neither is he. You must find the place of the first light before they do." The warmth from the pendant spread through him. And for a moment, the fog outside the car windows cleared completely, revealing a faint path leading into the woods behind the diner. A path he hadn't seen before. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The pendant cooled, and the weight of silence returned. But Sundar knew now. He couldn't stop. He couldn't go back. He looked down at Arav, who stared back at him with those strange shimmering eyes, as though already knowing what lay ahead. "We'll find it," Sundar whispered to him, though his own voice shook. "Whatever it is, we'll find it." But even as he said the words, he felt the faintest prick of fear at the edges of his resolve, because deep down, he could already feel that the path ahead would cost him more than he was ready to give. And somewhere in the distance, beyond sight but not beyond sense, he felt them stirring again, waiting. Watching. Asterisk, the place of first light. The morning sun climbed slowly over the horizon. But the light felt weak, as though even the day itself was hesitant to begin. Sundar sat in the parked car, staring at the faint trail he had glimpsed behind the diner before it vanished into fog. He hadn't moved for almost an hour, his hands resting on the steering wheel, His thoughts churning like storm clouds. Aravi slept in his arms again. His breath steady, warm, his tiny fist clutching the edge of Sundar's jacket. The memory of the voice that had spoken in his mind still lingered, soft, yet heavy with authority. You must find the place of the first light before they do. Sundar closed his eyes and let the words echo. Even without fully understanding, some part of him already believed. There was a strange clarity in the voice, as though it was speaking not only to his ears, but to a part of himself he had long forgotten. He looked down at the pendant resting on his chest, the star-shaped metal now cool again. Instinctively, he touched it and felt a faint pulse, like a quiet heartbeat. Under his fingers, he opened the car door and stepped out. Into the cold morning air, the woods behind the diner were thicker than they looked from the road. Twisted trees loomed overhead, their bare branches scratching at the pale sky. The earth beneath his feet was soft, littered with fallen leaves and strange symbols carved faintly into stones half buried in moss. Sundar tightened his hold on Arav, who was awake now, staring wide-eyed at the path ahead. Each step forward felt heavier, as though the air itself was pressing against him, testing him. More than once he thought he heard whispers just beyond the edge of hearing, faint, distant, impossible to understand. After what felt like hours, the path opened into a small clearing where the light was different, softer, somehow golden, though the sun above was still pale and weak. At the center of the clearing stood a circle of stones, ancient and worn, with faint markings etched deep into their surfaces. In the middle of the circle, a single beam of warm light shone straight down onto the earth, illuminating a flat stone slab. Sundar stopped at the edge of the circle, his breath catching in his throat. The place radiated something he couldn't name. It was beautiful but solemn, inviting but heavy. Like standing inside a memory that didn't belong to him, he stepped closer and placed Arav gently on the stone slab. The child lay there quietly, staring up into the golden light without fear. The pendant around Sundar's neck grew warm again, brighter this time, until faint rays of light began to spill from the star's edges. He instinctively reached up and removed it, holding it over Ave, though the pendant itself knew what came next. As soon as the light from the pendant touched the child's chest, the markings on the stones around them flared to life. Soft, glowing lines that snaked across the ground, connecting the circle into a web of golden patterns. The air grew warmer, and the whispers grew louder now, surrounding Sundar. Though still impossible to understand, he closed his eyes, letting the sounds wash over him, letting himself feel whatever this place was asking of him. When he opened them again, he saw something that made him stumble back. A figure stood on the opposite side of the circle. At first, Sundar thought it was a trick of the light. But as the figure stepped into the glow, he realized it was no stranger. It was himself. The man in the circle looked just like him. The same face, the same hands, but his eyes were brighter, sharper, as though they carried the weight of centuries. His clothes were unfamiliar, long, dark robes embroidered with faint golden lines that shimmered when he moved. The other Sundar stared at him silently for a long moment before speaking. "You've finally come," he said, his voice both his own and not. Sundar felt his knees weaken. What is this?" He managed to whisper. The other Sundar didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked slowly around the circle, his gaze occasionally drifting to Arav lying in the center. "This is what you were always meant to find," the figure finally said, "but you forgot. You chose to forget. You buried the truth beneath years of noise and ambition. Yet still, here you are." Sundar took a shaky step closer, his heart pounding. "What truth?" he demanded, his voice louder now. The figure's gaze darkened. "That you are not just the man you've been pretending to be. And that child," he nodded toward Arav, "is not just a child. He is the beginning of what you could not finish." Sundar shook his head, overwhelmed. "None of this makes sense," he said. The other Sundar tilted his head, almost sadly. "That is because you still see with only half your eyes. He replied. He reached into his robe and pulled out another pendant, identical to the one Sundar carried, and held it up. You are the key, he said softly, and he is the door. Before Sundar could respond, the golden light began to shift, growing dimmer, flickering as though struggling to stay alive. The whispers rose into a chorus now, urgent. Warning! The other Sundar's expression hardened. They are coming, he said sharply. You don't have much time. The wind picked up suddenly, sending leaves and dust swirling around the circle. The trees groaned and the sky above darkened, swallowing what little sunlight remained out from the edge of the clearing. Dark shapes began to emerge, tall, faceless figures, their movements slow but relentless. Sundar felt his chest tighten as they stepped closer, their presence heavy and suffocating. The other Sundar turned to him, his voice now fierce and commanding. Choose now, he said. Take the child and run, or finish what you came here to do, but know this, whatever you choose, there is no turning back. The golden light flared once more, brighter than before, and for a split second Sundar felt as though he could see everything, all the pieces of himself he had ignored, all the roads he hadn't taken, all the faces of people he didn't recognize, but somehow loved. But the vision shattered as one of the dark figures stepped into the circle. The stones beneath it cracking underfoot, the other Sundar stepped forward, blocking its path. Go, he shouted but Sundar didn't move. He stood frozen at the edge of the circle, his heart hammering, his hands trembling as the pendant around his neck pulsed wildly with heat and light behind him. More figures slipped from the trees, their forms endless, their whispers now loud enough to drown out thought itself. He looked at Arav, still lying calmly in the center of the stones, his strange, shimmering eyes fixed on him, as though waiting to see which choice he would make. The ground beneath the circle began to split, faint cracks spreading outward as the light sputtered. And the figures closed in. Sundar took a breath, feeling everything he was, and everything he wasn't, hanging in the balance. He stepped forward, just as his foot touched the edge of the circle. The ground gave way, and the golden light exploded outward. Engulfing everything, the last thing he saw was Arav's tiny hand reaching for him, and the faint sound of his own voice, though he hadn't spoken, whispering, remember who you are. And then the world went dark. Asterisk, the truth beneath the light. At first there was nothing. No sound, no light. Only the faint sensation of falling, as though Sundar's body no longer belonged to him. He felt weightless yet heavy, his mind teetering between sleep and wakefulness, his memories flashing in broken fragments. The house. In Chennai, his father's hands teaching him to tie his first knot, his mother's voice humming a song in the kitchen, a sharp knock on his door at dawn, the baby's breath warm against his neck, the circle of stones, the golden light, asterisk,